welcome to this episode of Quake It Up. In this episode, we're going to be talking about Quakers and the printing press. This is the second video of my Quaker History playlist, and as I was editing the first one, which is about the influences on Quakerism, by the time I finished editing, I was like, should have really talked about the printing press. That would have been the sixth. Unfortunately, 6 doesn't have the same ring as 5, so I thought, hang on, why not make a whole video on the printing press and Quakerism? Because realistically, as well as the other 5 mentioned in the previous video, Quakerism certainly, whilst it would have probably still come into effect without the printing press, there is absolutely no question that it would not have been able to have spread in that time without the printing press. It would have been unfeasible for these northern seekers to manage to create such a following were it not for the printing press. So we're going to talk about looking at what the state of the printing press was like at that time, how the Quakers were able to use it to their advantage, and also following on from an episode on the Quaker podcast, which I've also mentioned in another video, where they made the parallel very clear between how Quakers used the printing press and how Quakers could be using social media. I think that link between social media and the printing press is a very good one, because I think it was the means by which information was spread in that period, and also the novelty of it as well. It was a new wave, and especially in the 17th century, the speed at which one could publish, well, the speed increased, so you were able to publish way more quickly. So I think it does have the same kind of vibe as social media does now. And so let's look at how the Quakers used it. And yeah, if I can make some modern parallels, then why not? One of the main sources I'm going to be using in this episode is an article by Betty Hagland on Quakers and the printing press. It's available in the book Early Quakers and Their Theological Thought, which is kind of what I'm using to talk about this history of certainly the early part of Quaker history, and would recommend especially that this article. This really kind of opened my eyes as to the mechanics as to how it worked and why the Quakers were so effective at using it. So just a bit of background as to where the publishing world was in the 1650s, or certainly by the Civil War period, is that you see a move away from printing in folio form, so that's a really big kind of book size, to a more pamphlet quarto style of publishing, which is a lot smaller, a lot quicker to produce. So if you look at titles published, it seems like there's a massive boom of different titles being published around this period, which is true, but it's mainly because there's a shift in the type of publishing that was going on. So it wasn't these big, long tracts, they were shorter, punchier works. So this was the kind of milieu that Quakers were coming into, that they would be using so effectively. What this enabled the publishing world to do, or certainly the authors, was to instantly rebut anything that came through. So there was this dialogue in writing, which we see quite a lot through the early Quaker period, as Quakers were printing, explaining their beliefs. People were instantly coming back and saying, no, you're wrong because of this, this, and this, and they would instantly come back and say, yes, no, we're right because this, this, and this. So this to and fro must have been very exciting, but also meant that for the Quakers, it helped them to specify precisely what they did believe, and debunk some of the false things that were said about them rather quickly. So just reading some of these figures, I think it's absolutely amazing, just the amount that these Quaker writers were writing. So Betty Hagland says that by 1656, there were 291 titles by nearly 100 named authors. That represents an average of more than one Quaker book or Quaker pamphlet a week. Another thing that I think is quite nice is that there's a list of the top 8 Quaker publishers. So without further ado, the order goes like this. In 8th place is Richard Hubberthorne. 7th place, William Dewsbury, Yorkshireman. Francis Howgill comes in 6th. Edward Burrow in 5th. James Parnell, 4th. Top 3, Richard Farnworth, Yorkshireman. James Naylor, Yorkshireman, and probably not surprising in first place is George Fox. I will talk about James Naylor in more detail, but it seems like had Bristol not happened to James Naylor, he probably would have had more, uh, published more than George Fox ultimately did. So maybe Yorkshire would have won overall over Leicestershire, but hey ho. What I also think is quite nice is the connection between the publisher and these early Quakers. I think it's not necessarily something that we think of when talking about Quaker history, but it's actually really important for quite a lot of reasons. It didn't mean that Quakers or early Quakers always used the same publisher. There were three or four that were really big. However, what is seemingly important is that how these publishers actually helped the early Quakers settle in London. So, Quakerism, as I will talk about in another video, started out in the north. These were people from Leicestershire, from Lancashire, from Yorkshire, and they did come down into London, but they didn't know anyone. And they kept on coming. And so what these publishers were able to do were basically to act as middlemen in order to help connect new-come Quakers with those already established or the ones that have already come to London. So I like this sort of social role that they play as well. Now, interestingly, most of these publishers don't actually seem to be Quakers. What their business model seems to be is that they're publishing radical, religious or radical political texts. Gotta find your niche, and but because of that, they were actually under a lot of persecution, which is so obviously there was money in it. Otherwise, why would you put yourself up for persecution for a belief that isn't your own? Probably the most famous of these, especially early Quaker publishers, was Giles Calvert, who owned the very cool name publishing house of the Black Spread Eagle. Who, as I said, there's lots of evidence of him meeting, helping Quakers meet up, and published pretty much every early Quaker you can imagine. But he didn't just publish Quaker stuff. He also published other radical, always radical, writers as well. So Gerald Winstanley, for example, and also very interestingly, Jakob Böhme, who was a German radical theologian. Interestingly, because this is the main guy that when Rufus Jones is pitching his alternative history to Quakerism as not coming from a Puritan background, but coming from a continental mystic background, this is his main guy. And so it is interesting that Giles Calvert also published Jakob Böhme. And so if Jakob Böhme was published by the same person that George Fox used to publish his stuff, then yes, okay, I suppose there is a likelihood that he would have read Jakob Böhme. And I think actually it is very likely. However, I don't think that still fits in to completely change how the majority of people have seen that Quakerism started. And I think, especially if you look at the life of George Fox, which we will, his upbringing was Puritan. So I think that is a much more obvious leaning. And also interestingly, is that a lot of these Quaker writers or Quaker publishers seem to have stopped publishing at very interesting moments in time. So, for example, Giles Calvert stopped publishing really after 1656, which is the year of uh, James Naylor's Bristol event. Um, could that be because he thought that that was going over the pale? Did he think that he wasn't happy with how the Quakers supported James Naylor? Who knows? But there seems to be was it not relevant at all? Who knows? But I think that's quite interesting that these Quaker events also fit in quite nicely with the publishers as well, even if it is just coincidental. But the next big Quaker publisher after Giles Calvert, Thomas Symonds, did something very similar. So when there was a schism, more on this later, between John Perrott and George Fox mainly, but the rest of the Quaker establishment. And then suddenly after this time, Thomas Simmons stops publishing Quaker stuff, and he did publish stuff by John Perrott. So did he not like the way that Quakers dealt with John Perrott and so stopped publishing Quaker stuff? Who knows? But I think also very interesting. So I think the importance of publishing in Quakerism cannot be overstated. I think Quakers latched onto it very quickly. So if we say that Quakerism started very early in the 1650s, they were publishing like a tract a week in the same year. It's very impressive what they were able to do, especially considering they were far away from maybe the publishing hub, which would have been London. But that's another reason why they went down there. These publishers also helped them link up with each other, so to help strengthen the Quaker community nationwide and certainly within London, I think this is probably as well as just because that's where people are, that was probably one of the more predominant reasons as to why they went to London in the first place, is in order to create that network, to be able to print and to distribute that in a way that they just couldn't from Swarthmore Hall, for example. So I suppose what can we learn from that? I think now the goal of especially the very, very early Friends was evangelization. They thought that the end of the world was coming, and they believed that they had the correct godly message, and they wanted everyone to be a part of that. So they were desperate for evangelization. Nowadays in Quakerism, we're not really bothered about evangelization too much. We're not out there to convert people in the same way that other denominations might be. And obviously, lots of denominations do use social media in order to try and evangelize like that. However, I think probably what's more important is that social media gives people the opportunity to discover and for people to share their experiences and to share their faith. And I think that's something, certainly doesn't mean this is what I'm doing. I'm not looking necessarily to evangelize anyone and make anyone Quaker, but that's not my primary goal. It's just to share information, share something that I'm interested in. And I think that's something that we can do, and to leave a record of who we are and why we do what we do. I think it doesn't have to be always necessarily new media, new way to evangelize and to spread the word. I think it can be to explain our words, to talk about our words, to create a community of our words, in the same way that these publishers help link early Quakers to other early Quakers as their new come from the countryside into the big city. Kind of the same thing. We can use social media to create this sense of community with Quakers from all over the world now. So, I've been speaking on this channel with friends or Quaker enthusiasts, if you want, from South America and from Finland and all sorts. So, it's a great opportunity for us to create a community. So, no, we're not looking to evangelize in the same way. But I would love to see a greater Quaker presence in social media, just talking about it and to have people making comments and making connections, making links throughout continents and throughout the world, which I think is absolutely in the same line as the early Quakers and the printing press. Thank you very much for watching the video. If you liked it, please do click on the thumbs up and the subscribe button to get more videos about Quakerism in the UK today. It really does help, and thanks once again.